So now let's get into chapter 2. This is about production possibilities and comparative advantage. So in this chapter, we're going to look at maybe an individual or a company's options, so their production possibilities, what they can produce. You should remember this from last semester, production possibility frontier, or sometimes it's called the production possibility curve. Later, we're going to use this in our chapter about demand to talk about our budget constraint or our budget set. So for an individual consumer, the production possibility frontier is going to tell us the maximum amount of goods they can purchase given their current income and given the prices of those options. And then we're going to look more at opportunity cost, absolute advantage, comparative advantage, and specialization and trade. So if you remember from Econ 1A, you should have touched on some of this before, but we will continue to use it this semester. And since it's, these are some of the foundational concepts, it's important that we really nail this down. So even though I know a lot of you already have learned this, most of you don't remember exactly how to use this. You need a little bit more practice. So we're just going to go over it again here. I might speed through it a little bit faster because I know that you've had this before. So feel free to pause, rewatch this. And at the end of this unit, I've posted some more practice and more videos if you would like more information. Okay, so here's our production possibility frontier, also called the production possibility curve. So PPF or PPC. This is showing all possible production combinations with a given set of resources. So in this example, in this economy, they only produce industrial robots or pizzas or some combination in between. All right, so this solid line here is showing you the maximum that they can produce in this economy. So they can produce 10 industrial robots and 0 pizzas. They can produce 0 robots and 4 pizzas, or they can produce some of these other combinations in between. So this does not tell you what they actually end up producing. It just tells you with their set of current resources, the amount of labor they have in the economy, the amount of machinery and factory, natural resources. This is everything that they're capable of producing. All points on this line are considered efficient. So it does not matter if we're at point E, we're using all of our resources for robots, we're not making any pizza, or we're at point E, where we're using all of our resources for pizza, nothing for robots. Those are both efficient points, or combinations in between. So anything on this line is considered efficient. Anything inside the line, so this shaded area in here, we can also make those combinations as well, right? So we're capable of making 10 robots, but we could also make 5 robots if we wanted, right? We could also make 3 robots if we wanted. You don't have to make your maximum. We could produce at this point right here, call this point F, where we have 6 industrial robots and 2 pizzas. But this is inefficient because we could be producing more of one or both of those goods. And then anything outside the line is considered unattainable. So point W over here, this is at 8.5 robots and 6 pizzas. This is unattainable. We don't currently have the resources in this economy to be able to produce at that level. Now maybe we'll get there if we have economic growth, right? It's still possible we can produce that someday, but not today. What we're going to see when we do our comparative advantage example is that sometimes if we actually work together with someone else who has a different specialty, we can produce at points that would be unattainable if we were trying to do it by ourselves. But economics is all about scarcity and trade-offs, right? So if we're already at an efficient point, let's say we're producing at point A, but we realize that we like eating, we don't only want robots, we need some pizza. If we are already at an efficient point of producing all of our robots, if we want to get more pizza, we're going to have to give up some robots. There's going to be a trade-off. So if we're already being efficient, we're already using all of our resources, if we want more of one good, we must give up some of another good, or somehow increase our total resources. Production possibility curves demonstrate the law of increasing opportunity costs. So as more of a good is produced, its marginal opportunity costs increase. So we can see that here on this graph we have tablet computers and smartphones. So maybe this is Samsung or some company that produces both of these things. You could imagine that some of the resources needed to produce these things would be similar, right? They probably use similar metals, similar chips, similar materials, maybe even the labor that assembles the smartphones. That skill translates pretty easily into assembling tablet computers. But there are other things that aren't going to match properly. So like if you're looking at the mold for the tablet screen, it's going to be much bigger than the mold for the smartphone screen. And so resources are not equally suited for every single type of activity. I think this is a little bit more obvious in our last example with robots and pizza. A lot of the things you need for pizza, you're not going to use for robots, right? Some things might be similar. So if we're going to cook pizzas, we need ovens. So we're going to need some mechanical parts, metal, things like that, which might also be able to be used in robots. But other things that we would use for making pizzas, such as tomato sauce or cheese or flour, is not really going to go well when we try to make robots. So some resources are better suited for production of one good over another. So we see this production possibility curve is bowed outward. Okay, so let's say we're producing at point B, and we have 95, or let's start at point A. Okay, so we're producing at point A, we have 100 tablets and no smartphones. But we realize as a company that there's this increasing demand for smartphones. It would not be a good idea to only produce tablets. So we say, all right, let's switch some of our production over to tablets. If they decrease by 5 tablets, they can increase their smartphone production by 20. And that gets us to point B. But let's say they want to increase smartphone production even more. If they drop down by another 5 tablets, now they're only getting 10 extra smartphones. The opportunity cost is increasing. It's costing more and more smartphones, or more and more tablets per smartphone. And if you look down here, if we're at point D, if we give up 5 tablets, it's only going to get us an extra 2 smartphones. Because the resources are not all equally suited. Now, if this was a straight line, which we are going to see when we do our comparative advantage questions, so we just have a straight line, then it's a constant trade-off, constant opportunity cost. But in real life, our production possibility frontiers are always going to be bowed outward. There's always going to be increasing opportunity costs because resources are not perfectly suited for production of all goods. The goal for a lot of economies is to shift this PPF. We want to increase our total possibility for production, right? Because we want to get to points that were unattainable. We want to be able to produce more smartphones and more tablets. Or let's say we're at this point right here, which was 100 tablets. If we shift our PPC, our PPF curve, we can keep that 100 tablets and now also produce 80 smartphones. Okay, so we want more, we want to increase this. We want more resources. That can happen through economic growth. It can happen because our production is more efficient. It can happen because we've increased some of our factors of production. So we have more natural resources, we have more labor, we have more efficient labor, we have more capital, right? If you remember from last semester, capital is machinery, tools, technology that's used in the production process. And entrepreneurs as our innovators, the people who take these other factors and put them together to create new technology, to create new products. As we increase that, we're going to be increasing our total production possibility. If we want to invest in factories and equipment now, we're going to be able to have more growth in the future. So the more we invest in capital resources, the more we're going to be able to produce in the future. Population growth. So our production possibility curve is going to shift every time our population increases. Every time we invest in knowledge and technology, that's going to shift that production outward, because it means each person, each worker is going to be able to produce more by themselves or more per hour than they did before. So right now you're in college, you're investing in knowledge capital, human capital. You're helping to shift our PPC, our PPF out. When we look at the economy as a whole, we can separate products into two different categories. So capital goods and consumption goods. Capital goods are things that are used to produce machinery, factories, education, technology, things that we're going to use to produce other stuff in the future. Consumption goods, this is things that we're using up today. So food, clothing, housing. Well, housing could also be capital. We'll take that one off the list for just now. But things that we're using up right now. So if we want to have larger increases in our production in the future, we have to produce more capital goods today. So this curve on the left is showing one level of production that's leading to an increase in our PPF. The graph on the right, you can see, has a much higher level of capital production, producing more than twice as much, right? Almost 3 times as much over here. And so what you see is that we get this even larger shift of the curve. So there's a trade-off. We're sacrificing some of our current consumption so that we get even greater consumption in the future. And all of you are doing that right now by being in school, right? You're sacrificing something. You're giving up something from today so you can have a better job in the future. So you can have more money in the future, right? More consumption in the future. So economic growth requires using resources today to produce capital goods. Okay, so now let's get into our discussion about absolute and comparative advantage. So absolute advantage means that somebody can produce more than somebody else. So let's say we have 2 companies, firm A and firm B. And they both make apple pie. They make apple pies. So every week, firm A can produce 1,000 pies, and firm B can produce 800 pies. Firm A has the absolute advantage. They can produce more pies than firm B, right? They're more efficient. In the same amount of time, they can produce more pies than their competitor. So this is absolute advantage. When we're talking about countries, larger countries tend to have an absolute advantage in certain products over others. They can just produce more than someone else. Comparative advantage, though, means that someone has a lower opportunity cost of producing a particular good. So absolute advantage, you're just looking at one product, one good or one service. Comparative advantage, we're looking at 2 or more products. So it means that there's some lower implicit cost of production, right? What else could they be producing? What else are they giving up? So comparative advantage means you're relatively more efficient when comparing the production of 2 goods. So absolute advantage, one company is more efficient than the other if you're only looking at one product. Comparative advantage means you're relatively more efficient when comparing production of 2 goods. So they don't necessarily only have to make apple pie, right? They could also make cherry pie. And it could be that firm A can only make 20 cherry pies and firm B can make 600. Oops. In this example, it's clear that firm B is much better at making cherry pie. Firm A is much better at making apple pies. They can specialize, maybe corner the market on each type of pie. Okay, so firm B is relatively more efficient than firm A. Firm B also has an absolute advantage in cherry pie. Okay. You can ignore these numbers for now. We'll go over an actual calculatable example. So comparative advantage is the basis for trade. So let's say two countries want to work together and say, I don't want to just produce everything myself. Just like we saw in the video, I don't want to produce every single component of this pin. I just want to assemble the pins and I want to buy the parts from somewhere else. Okay, so companies, countries, people can trade with each other if they work with their comparative advantages. So it doesn't matter that someone else might be more efficient at every type of activity than you are. You have a comparative advantage in something. There is something that you are relatively more efficient at compared to other people. Sometimes it gets discouraging when you see other people, I don't know, taking 500 classes, getting A's in everything, also working, having an internship, doing all of this stuff, and it can feel like, what's the point, right? I can't even compete in this market because look at someone else, like they can do all of this stuff. But even if that's true, right? And you know, it is for every single one of us. Every one of us can find somebody who's better at everything than us, right? None of us are at the top of anything. It's just how life is. But all of us have something that we have a comparative advantage in. Something that we have a lower implicit cost of production. Something that we are relatively more efficient at. So part of being in college is figuring out what your comparative advantage is. It could be that you just get economics. It just works for you. You still have to study, you still have to try hard. Some of the math is a little bit confusing, but it speaks to you, right? It relates to the way that you think. Maybe you have a comparative advantage in accounting. You have an accounting brain. Accounting makes my brain hurt. Everything has a credit and a debit. I used to work as a budget analyst for a government agency, and I liked that. That made sense to me. We would write down on a paper, like, how much we're going to spend in each of these different categories. But then I'd have to go talk to the accounting department and they'd say, no, you need to put depreciation in here. You need to have this credit here. You need to do this and this. And I'm like, no, this makes no sense because this looks like we're spending more than we are. And then they would spend 10 minutes explaining to me why that wasn't true. And then I'd still be confused, but we'd put it in anyway. Okay. So there are some things that you're going to be good at, right? Maybe you are good at cooking. You're good at baking. Maybe you're good at fixing things, right? Everybody has some kind of comparative advantage. You just need to figure out what it is. Once you figure out your comparative advantage, you can specialize in that, and that's how you're going to earn the maximum amount of money that you can earn. Okay? And hopefully, right, your comparative advantage usually is going to be something that you enjoy to some extent, because that lowers the implicit cost of production. Okay, but we'll talk about that a lot more during the semester, and if you ever want to come talk to me about what you should major in or career options or any of that, I love talking about all of that stuff. I am a labor economist. I know lots about labor markets, so that's one of my favorite subjects. Traditionally, countries will get a comparative advantage because they have access to certain natural resources. Maybe they have something in their regional climate, like a lot of fruit is grown in tropical environments near the equator. Bananas all come from places that are south of where we are now. Comparative advantages can come from labor supply, human capital, government, infrastructures. So there's a whole bunch of things that can give countries a lower implicit cost of production for certain types of goods. And then the idea is that if we know our comparative advantages and we specialize in those things, we can trade with each other and end up at some point that's beyond our original PPC. So you should always trade if you have a lower comparative advantage, or you have a different opportunity cost as somebody else. Okay, so if you guys have the same exact PPC, if all countries have the same production possibility curve, you're not going to get gains from specialization because we're all equally good at everything. We're all just equally efficient. That's not realistic though, right? We're not all equally good at everything else. Even if you just look at that list on the last slide, our climate, right? The weather in a certain part of the world can give that region a comparative advantage that someone else maybe doesn't have. So the idea is that we can produce more stuff together than any of the combinations that we produced alone. So in this example, we have you and your roommate. You're both computer programmers and you've started this company. you have clients who want computer programs and you have clients who want websites. And you're deciding how you should split that up. Should you just take turns? You each take one computer program, then you each take a website. Should one of you specialize in something versus the other? So this graph is showing your two PPCs, your two production possibility frontiers. Here for you, you can make 16 computer programs or 8 websites per month. Your roommate can make either 16 websites or 8 computer programs. So this example is a nice one to start off with because it's a little bit more obvious who should do what. You can produce 16 computer programs in the same amount of time that it takes your roommate to produce 8. Right? So you are better at producing computer programs than your roommate is. Okay, so you should probably do that. Okay, your roommate can produce 16 websites in the same time that you can produce 8. Right? They're twice as good at this as you are. So they should probably produce websites. I'm going to show you how to calculate this later so that it doesn't even have to be like this. You could have something like this if this was your roommate instead. You guys should still specialize in trade, even though they're better at everything, right? So we'll see some examples about that. So let's say you guys didn't specialize. You each just spent half of your time doing each task. So you spent half of your time in websites and half of your time in computer programs. Okay, so you produce 8 computer programs and 4 websites. Let's say your roommate, does the same thing. They spend half, you guys just decided you're going to split the work evenly and do half and half. Okay. So they produce 8 websites and 4 computer programs. Okay, so you produce 8, your roommate produces 4 programs, so combined you are producing 12. And websites, you are producing 4, your roommate is producing 8, so you're producing 12. If instead you specialize and then just split the money evenly, for programs, you're just going to produce 16. And for websites, your roommate is going to produce 16. Right? So if you specialize, you end up with more total projects completed than if you try to just split the work and each do half and half. This is also true when you have group projects for class. If you just make everybody do the same tasks, right? Let's say you have a PowerPoint presentation and you say, okay, I'm going to take the first section, you take the second section, you take the third section, and we're each going to read about our topic, we're going to make 5 slides, and then we're going to present on that. You're going to end up with 12, right? You're going to end up with a lower grade. Whereas if you figure out what everybody is good at, and then you split the tasks up accordingly, you're going to be spending less time, you're going to get better quality project. So maybe you have someone who's really good at researching and reading and summarizing. Have one person do that. And another person who's really good at making PowerPoint slides. Have them do that part, right? So if you figure out what everyone's good at, you specialize and you split the tasks up that way, it works out better for everyone. We don't always like doing that though, because we feel like, oh, that's not fair, right? I did more work, or, we should all have to do the same kind of tasks. But no, trust me, it works out better. So if you split this, that's kind of like you're doing 8 and 8 of each, right? So that's this point right here. An unattainable point. That's a point that neither of you can get to on your own. You can't produce 8 and 8. But when you specialize and split the money, right, or you're trading essentially, you get to this point that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to get to. Here's your combined PPC. So here's the point 16, 16. Let me erase this so you can see it. Right, your combined PPC, you can get to this point, right? And if you split that in half, that's down here. Okay, Picking fruit. Actually, this video is almost at an hour if you watched the other thing. So I'm going to stop this recording right here and start a new one. Just to make you pause, give yourself a little bit of break, and then we'll continue on with another example about comparative advantage.